Hello, and welcome to a conversation about artificial intelligence in Fire Emblem 8 GBA. I want to make this video because there's a couple of different AI commands that I think are really good that I don't see used very often, and I want to talk about them and why they're good, but I also thought it'd be a good idea to provide a short primer on the different types of AI and how to think about them. So I'm going to be focusing mostly on this secondary AI here because this is really the bread and butter, and you can see here this is my favorite AI in existence. It's so good, and I'm going to talk about why it is. But this is a big one. AI3 and AI4 are a little bit more straightforward, so we can cover that quickly. AI3, or target AI, this determines if the AI will use recovery when it's below a certain threshold. So not in recovery mode means that it'll continue to attack, even if it's holding a vulnerary or an elixir. It'll just keep attacking, it'll never try and run away. It also has the secondary piece here that does like prioritized damage, which is for accuracy, standard, max damage. There's an archer one. There's a few others that I'm not super familiar with. Someone a bit more in depth would need to do it. I usually just do prioritized damage, accuracy, or standard, depending on the unit. But again, it depends. I haven't experimented a ton to see what types of differences this makes, but generally speaking, recovery mode, important. And then this last one here, retreat AI. Retreat means they move. There's also boss AI. If you're using skill system, this is what makes enemies display as having no movement if they are in place. So that's a really useful trick. And then our first AI has a lot of options, and there are certain things that are going to be a little bit more niche and self-explanatory than others. Generally speaking, I'm using two of these. For thieves, I'm probably using 06, do not act, move only other, and that's going to be in combination with this usually for the secondary AI, attack village and treasure, then move to escape point. So this is your thief AI. This is pretty standard where they're just moving. For brigands, I would have them do attack village and treasure, then move towards enemy, and then chance of action 100%, because that means that they'll beeline for villages or chests or whatever you want them to go for. But if you're in their range, they're going to prioritize you instead. That's pretty standard brigand AI. So just a quick overview there. But AI1, there's a couple of things here that are useful. I generally am using chance of action 100%. And then for stationary enemies, I might want chance of action 100%, attack only when adjacent. I'll combine that with an AI4 and a do not move. So this means stationary enemies. This is what you see me do with a lot of armor knights. So you can see here, actually this guy has the wrong AI, but you can see chance of action 100%, attack only when adjacent, do not move, don't retreat, boss AI. Pretty straightforward for these types of units that are just kind of, as you can see, staying in place. You don't want them to show as moving at all. This is how you do that. Now, to get to the meat of the video. AI2. So there's a number of settings for AI2 that you should consider. Just gonna lower the music a little bit. A couple of different options for you to consider here for AI2. And AI2 is usually used to determine targeting and movement. While AI1 is saying, like, I'm either going to attack or I'm going to have this objective, this AI determines the movement. And this is really important for the map flow. So your first AI here is move towards enemy. This is just charging. The enemy is going to be on the map and they're going to charge. I use this a lot. Everyone uses this for reinforcements because you just want them to keep moving. You don't want them to stay in place because they're probably going to block the spawn point otherwise. So move towards the enemy. That's what it exactly sounds like. They're just going to move in regardless. This is really useful for enemies that you kind of want to just like either reinforcing or that you just want to move through the map from the starting position. Do not move means they stay in place until you're within their range. This is pretty classic, like bait and switch setup, which is fine. It has its place. I recommend, not doing it all the time. As you can tell, if you were to make a map with all, and I see this sometimes, especially for newer hacks, if you set up your AI so that everyone is moved towards enemy, like look at this map, for example. This is chapter 3.5 from Vision Quest. If you look at all these enemies for a second, if I set all of them to move towards the enemy, they would all gradually cluster in a few spots, and I would just have this huge conga line of enemies at specific points. All the battling would take place in like a few set spots, and I wouldn't really even have an opportunity to explore much of the map, which I find to be a dissatisfying experience. And while move towards enemy can be a great AI, using all of it at once, not ideal. I'm not advocating that you should use any one particular AI all the time, but again, just be cognizant of that. Similarly, do not move AI. I think this is an even more common mistake, is that maps are set up so none of the enemies move, unless you're in their range. What this ends up doing is it sets up a lot of bait and switch, which means that it encourages the player to move into the edge of the enemy's range and wait, and then attack with whoever, counter with whoever their strongest unit is, either one round it or set up a kill for another unit to finish them off, and then go rinse and repeat. I think a lot of people dislike this type of Fire Emblem. It's certainly really boring if it's the entire map, and it generally means low urgency or low pressure because you can approach it at your own pace, and you can just really only engage in combat with units that you feel very confident can take hits, and you don't have to make a ton of trade-offs. It's really boring. So you never want to do all do not move AI. It certainly has its place. And I think do not move AI is really good either in like a very small map where you don't have a ton of wiggle room from enemy to enemy and you're naturally going to go into their ranges but don't want them crowding you too much, kind of like that problem we see with move towards enemy AI where they all charge in. If you have a very small map and a bunch of enemies with do not move AI, if you're in their range, they're going to move towards you anyway. So something to keep in mind there. So it's good in those tighter map situations. I like it on specific turns where there's like a group of enemies that are kind of waiting for you and you have to figure out like what's the best way to break this enemy formation. I think that can be done really well. But again, this is like you're seasoning your dish. You don't want the entire thing to be coated in salt. We talked about, let's see. Then there's also wait AI. So AI12 here, or AI, setting 1-2. Wait one turn, set AI2 to 0-0, which means move towards enemy. So this means that it'll wait for a turn before they move. This has its place as well, especially if you want to have enemies visible but not do anything and then start to charge in from further away. That can be a good timing mechanism. You can also do something similar. I know Mint X has created a really cool ASM hack for additional AI settings that allow you to set how many turns they will wait for. I personally have not used it, but that's an option that's probably a bit more elegant than what I do, which is I set events for specific units to change their AI to start moving. So the CHAI, the chai command, is really useful in conjunction with set unit status. Both are very useful commands for helping create more dynamic AI. I do this a lot with moving bosses, where a boss will announce, "Grr, I have to join the fray," and then on the next turn, he's like, "We're charging," and then that will change the AI for everyone to move in. And one of the weaknesses of this approach is that, one, it's all in events, and two, I'd have to create separate unit ideas for specific units that I want to charge in with him as a result. If you're like me and generally use like one specific ID per unit type, it can be a little tricky to do unless you're comfortable with just like everyone charging in, which also has its place in certain contexts, but probably not all the time. So that's something to consider as well. But the wait and then move can be really powerful. You can do it here with wait one turn, or you could set an event. There are other AIs that are a little bit more niche, like move to destroy walls and snags. This means they're just going to keep going and move snags, and then with a jack of action, similar to others, if they're in your range, if you're in their range, they're going to prioritize you over the walls and snags. But this is pretty common if you want enemies to break down some walls and stuff. Now then, and then I like go to escape point. This is I use a lot for green units when I have them fleeing. I set them to move only, go to escape point, so it's probably going to look something like this. Do not act, move only, go to escape point. That means they're just running. They're straight beelining for whatever that escape point is. Note that escape points... I also will do this for thieves, like if you're thinking like FE3, the chapter where you get Fina and Navarre, and there's all those thieves running away, they're basically doing this. They're not out to attack you. They are just running towards a specific point. In GBA, it's important to note that this AI breaks when the path is blocked. The enemy will just not move if they're totally blocked. So if you completely block off a thief's path to escape, it'll stay still. Similarly, if you block off a green unit's path to escape, it'll stay still. So please be sure to consider that when designing your maps around these types of units. Now, we're 10 minutes in already, and I want to talk about the main event here, and that is, if possible, to attack in 2 actions, move towards the enemy. This AI is fantastic. It is the most useful AI and one of the most underutilized settings that I've seen. And what I like about it is that it creates an environment that is flexible to the player, but also applies pressure as they move. And in conjunction with other objectives that push the player forward, like solid anti-turtles, like in this case, you see there's some houses, like the player starting in this bottom right section, there are some houses up here that they'll want to get to. This is also a timed route map with a hard timer. And there are brigands that'll show up on turn 3, as you can see up here. They're going to rush for these houses. And that's going to incentivize the player to think, I need to move quickly to get there. Now, what I like about, if possible to attack in 2 actions, move towards the enemy. This does 2 things. In addition to what I said about allowing the enemies to move at the pace of the player, so versus something where it's like, wait 1 turn and then move, this is going to account, this is basically wait until the enemy is close enough that I can now move and force them into an action. And what I like about this, in addition to that piece around flexibility and kind of adjusting to the player's timing versus having to like map out turn by turn, is that it's going to put the enemy into the range of the player to run in and drive action. And that's what helps make a player phase oriented experience. So think back to when we talked about do not move AI, and when you're sitting at the edge of their range trying to pull enemies. Now think this, if there's an enemy that knows it can attack you in 2 movements, so typically it's with like 5 or 14 steps, it's going to move, and then it's going to move again. It's going to move again if it can still attack you within 2 ranges. Now typically, it's going to do, when by doing this, it moves into your range. This means that you now need to attack the enemy, or create a bigger defensive formation to bait it out further, but you won't be able to just precisely, neatly position yourself on the edge of its range. It's in your range, and now it has typically a larger pool of units to attack. Now, this is where it gets fun, is if you combine that with other enemies within the range, you set up some cool scenarios. So for example, we have, let's say, these enemies. If possible to attack in 2 actions, move towards the enemy, right? If possible, yeah, these guys are all doing this. So if I go left, let's say, I start here, I attack here. These guys can't attack me, but they're going to move in, and now these guys are going to start moving in, right? Because they're within 2 attacks. What this does is, let's say I attack and defeat this enemy. These guys move in. I have to consider, one, when I attack over here now, I have to prepare myself not only to dispatch the units that are in this section that started moving in, I also have another group of units that are also within a turn away that I now need to tank. And so it creates a lot more dynamic positioning challenges, in addition to encouraging you to use your units more on the player phase, which means making archers more valuable. It makes armor knights who can tank more valuable because you need more defense more frequently. and it overall just adds a lot of additional pressure while not forcing the player to play at a certain speed as something turn-based might, or slowing it down too much with like do not move everywhere. I think this AI is really, really powerful, and it's something that you should consider using and incorporating into your own work. I'll say that this AI, if you're going to be really lazy and use any AI on its own, this is probably the one to use, but that doesn't mean you should. But if you had to, this is what I would recommend. However, at its best, and if you were to look through my maps, I try to mix up the AI as much as possible, depending on the map objective and size and just the enemies. But if you have enemies that are moving within 2 range, it's going to help you like space out the map a little bit more. It's going to help you create scenarios where the enemies are a bit more dynamic. And it's going to do a nice job of adding more difficulty while still allowing you to move through the map. It's really the best of move towards the enemy and do not move, because it's kind of approaching it situationally. And in a way, it's almost like the inverse of the do not move scenario. They're now moving into the edge of your range for you to come in and attack them, so that more of their guys can come attack you in the following turn. And I think that that helps create a more dynamic and engaging Fire Emblem experience. So again, strongly encourage you to use this AI. I think it's really good. And that's really all I have to say about it. I'd love to hear if anyone else finds this AI particularly useful. I don't see it used a ton, but it's my favorite, and I think it's going to create some really fun situations. Like up here, for example, I have the boss, Wellington. He has this, if possible, to attack in 2 turns, move towards the enemy. He's going to move in, and these guys all have do not move. So it creates a fun little range puzzle where he now has moved in, and then if you try to like, bait him out at the edge here, you have these calves to deal with. So, I don't know, I think it's fun. Maybe it's a personal preference thing, but I'm curious to hear what you think. Again, try and mess around with your AI. It's a really good way to spice up your map and keep things dynamic. One AI I will never recommend, though, is this one for AI1. Attack if enemy is in half of unit's range. This is just not transparent because it's never clear, because the enemy will behave like do not move until you get into their range, and then they might not even move. And then when you think, okay, maybe they're supposed to be stationary, they're not. It's just not very transparent. We haven't developed a hack yet to show like half of the movement's range. I can't think of really good scenarios where you want this. And if you do, I would consider, why not just move them back a few spaces if you want the charge at a certain point. But anyway, guys, that's all I got to say on this. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think of this lovely, lovely AI6. If possible, to attack in 2 turns, move towards the enemy. Thanks again. See you later.